It's darker in the morning, quiet. The only sound is the slow shifting of the habitat below me as it searches for today's energy source. Like some giant roving beast, it sways and roams across the frozen plains, promising a different day from today, a different place, a different world. As I listen, it makes me think of a great elephant, gingerly feeling the ground beneath his feet before he commits and puts his full weight on his paw. I saw one once, an elephant. I was young, it was well before the warm years. I told my son about it. He gets so frustrated with me when I tell him stories of my childhood. He says, "Adna, why are you making up these stories?" He doesn't believe me, but he'll be doing the same with his own children one day, and they won't believe him. How could they? Then the world will be very different than it is today in 2079.
We are all in the year 2079. If you need to take another sip of your drink to believe it. And that's sort of halfway through this period of 100 years that we'll be spending the night on. So how did we get here? And some of us remember it. There's different ages here, and some of us remember how we got here. We used to call, some people talked about global warming, and all of that sort of fused into, it was just the warm years. And then it happened. It was 2052, some of you remember it really well. And the climacteric happened. And over 3 years, most of the Earth froze. And only 1/8 of all of us, of all humanity, survived. But we're a resilient species, and we came back. And we took knowledge that had been lost and recreated it. And now we had new knowledge and ideas, and we had to work together in a completely different way. And now we're in the light years, rebuilding everything we have. And we've gotten used to our world today. But it's something completely different from what they used to experience in the 2020s and the 2030s, even the 2040s. Everything is about survival for us. And all of those desires that they used to have back then are now transformed really into our need and our want for survival. So this is our new pyramid of needs. And survival is much more as a thread that goes around. In the dark years, we worked really hard. What tactically do we need to do to be able to have enough food, to be able to still survive in these caves that we were under as the earth froze? Could we get outside, and how often? And suddenly we realized that if survival was this new mode of being, it should also be something that we enjoy and that we have fun, and that joy is sort of intermingled with survival and entertainment. So who are we? Well, there's all of us, and there's also a few characters that I want to talk to you about that hopefully will help us illustrate some of these interesting times that we're on. Adna on the left, you heard her voice. She's a story builder, and we'll talk about her more. There's also Mac, she's an explorer, Anke, a teenager, and Sanders. So let's focus a little bit on them and figure out what is it that they're doing and how are they doing it and why. Adna's 39. She was actually 20 by the time of the climacteric, so she remembers the old years. Try to focus on the tone, how she sees things. What does she yearn for?
When I look at my son, I'm overcome with the urge to share with him the memories of my childhood. Things like climbing trees and swimming in the ocean. But I'm also excited by the memories of his childhood that he'll share with his own children one day.
So what does Adna do as a story builder? She has access to all this knowledge that comes from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, but she also has access to all of the things that are happening in this small community of people that are living together. There are about 150 of us that live together in this community, and she tries to combine knowledge that somebody figured out for a particular process in a bacteria with something else that had to do with scaffolding, with something else that had to do with a recipe for the kitchen, and pulls together all these little stories that then the rest of us could use for either changing the pants that we need to survive the cold outside, or maybe do a new game with our kids and we have to get them involved in all the activities that need to happen for survival. So she puts these stories together. This is what she does. This is the story builder. This is her role. She's talking here with her partner, Mathos. Mathos has been gone now for a year, and he's been exploring different areas, trying to identify different sources of energy new ways of dealing with challenges around temperature control, around, how do we metabolize certain proteins, for example. And she puts all of those stories together and shares them with the rest of us. So a key difference of today versus what we used to talk about in the 20, 30, 40s is what they used to think about production and all the infrastructure about it is pretty much replaced through the role of someone like Adna in this integration quickly of ideas that they used to talk about it. Even in the 2030s, they still had industries. They talked about the food industry, and they talk about, the chemical industry, they talk about pharmaceuticals. Most of that knowledge that we need today completely overlaps and is going back and forth in a flow. So it's really about integrating different pieces of knowledge into different combinations that allow us to survive. Where do we live? Well, we all know. Everybody here is familiar with the Elytras, no? This is where we live. Us and a couple hundred people. The Elytras are our home. This is where most of our activity happens. And we actually took inspiration from the tardigrades that you might remember. Back in the 2013, 2014, we identified all these interesting things about this little bug that can survive without water for many years and without oxygen. It can even survive in space. And it was the high school kids that got inspired about this, that started, with Adna's knowledge, started building the Elytras, which is where we live today. And the Elytraf is sort of like it's sort of like a biological RV. Not only is it biological in the sense that it has its own rhythm and its own activities biologically, but it also allows for a lot of the things that we need to do as humans to survive. We've been able to talk about all of our needs in terms of survival also happen within the Elytrafs. It's interesting. There was a time back then that some of you might remember, those of us that are older, when they used to talk about the digital world as opposed to the physical world. And then some people were very excited about what was coming in the biological world. They were excited about fields like what they used to call synthetic biology. You remember that back then, back all the way to the 2040s? Not anymore. Now it just is. The tools, the processes, the things we do flow simultaneously from the analog and the physical and the digital to the biological. And it happens in places like these. Actually, I remember 3 of you working on one of those just last week. Part of what we've been able to do is identify new sources of energy. So, as you know, these are the probes, as the Elytras move around, that find bacteria and different viruses to be able to pull energy that we need for all the things that happen in our life. So let's briefly hear from Mac. She's 30. She's what we call an unearther or an explorer.
I've developed a little routine for each discovery. After marking coordinates and taking a sample, I give the discovery a name and a character trait. Like I'll say, this is Franz, and he's really brave but has this great sense of humor. It's just a silly thing I started doing. I think it actually might be why so many people follow my data, though. Franz was a really popular one.
So Mac is an explorer, an unearther of new things. She goes out for 2 weeks into the snow, into these harsh conditions, and she finds sometimes a new mineral. And at the same time, Adna is completely, they're connected. It just happens. Now we're all connected. We don't think about, are we connected? Is there a channel for me to share with you this idea? We are. And what she does is she might find a mineral one week, she might find a different bacteria another week. Adna then suggests an experiment. That gets put into the stories by Adna, shared to others. Maybe some of you are working in one of the energy places. Others might be just cooking for the family and yet take some of that knowledge as part of what we need to do. So Mac does this. She leaves these beacons as she goes out, and these beacons are transformed into these beautiful maps of what is happening outside the Elytras. So for Mac, what has really allowed for her to do this is this continuous feedback loop of doing, teaching, showing, doing, teaching, showing. These borders that we used to have back in the 2020s, 2030s of somebody's a professional and was trained in this particular field and therefore teaches to others. Do you imagine? They actually went to a classroom and took notes on paper about learning things that some knew and others didn't. Now there's this flow of doing and teaching and making and shaping at the same time that others play part of it. So how is all this done? Well, this partly happens because, if you remember, 15 years ago, what was a result of some of the companies that had existed up to then merged into one entity. And that entity, 3 of us, we gave it a voice. And this is what they used to call a brand or a company, which is very different today. But that entity that we've done is Varia. So this company, this brand, this identity allows for all of that to happen. But what does it do? Varia doesn't make products that then somebody has to hire the marketing department to tell a story about them, so they go through a channel to push them down their throat or everybody else's throat. No, it doesn't make services that you need to figure out if you use this one versus that one. What Varia does is that it enables us individually at a small scale for the 150 of us to try experiments, do different things, combine things in our clothing or our kitchen or our energy source, wherever it is. We're just using the elements that Varia gives to us. So in a way, what Varia allows us to do is survive creatively. Varia is this entity that allows us to do this. And in order to do this, we have to collaborate in a completely different way. And we've had to do it, partly because it's up to the 150 of us to do it, and other hundreds that are in different Elitrefs. And we do that continuously. The interesting thing is that there was a time where there was a market that would assign value to brands depending on the impact they could have on putting products and services out for people to sort of bid on. Some of you might remember, they bought them. That is not the case anymore. There is no market here. There is no marketing department. There are a series of needs that we have that we want to enjoy them almost as entertainment that are attached to survival. And what Varia does, and where it captures its value, is it comes from all of us sharing a story. What about this? Could you try this? Why did you take that? Could we use that in construction of a new Elitref? Maybe we could use it for new instruments in our kitchen. It's about that sharing and doing that the value comes back into this entity, Varia. So in a way, for some of us, like Adna and Mac, it's a collective learning network. For others, there's an exchange platform of an idea of sharing. Some of you are very young and you don't even know about this. But back in the day, there was actually companies, there were entities sort of like Varia, just trust me on this one, that they had a department that did research and then a department that did development. Like for example, the pharmaceutical industry. I'm kidding, it's really. And they had meetings where they had people that would share their knowledge in a meeting from research to development. Can you imagine that? Well, not anymore. So for some, it's a connecting hub. And for others, it's really just a personal toolkit as we go about creatively surviving. So let me briefly tell you about Anke. Anke's a teenager. And yeah, some things haven't changed.
So I figured out this layering technique for the ice caves. It gives you a ton of traction without making your ankles look huge. You just gotta get this one type of braid down and you're set. The day I figured that out, Atna actually came and thanked me personally, in front of my friends and everything.
So Anke has been making amazing things since she was 5. Actually, most of the things that you guys are wearing today, she also developed. And those boots, she's been using the same boots for 10 years, just adjusting and changing new things onto them. For her, there is no consumption as a teenager. There's nothing to buy. It's about co-creating and sharing with others what she's been creating. Sanders is what they used to call a scientist. There were people that worked in a lab, sometimes by themselves, for years. And others would not even know about it until they read it on a paper. Can you imagine that?
I often think about what life would be like if our colony in Europa could have worked. And I wonder if we aren't better off now. The things we've discovered in my lab alone were unimaginable 30 years ago. I found that sometimes travesty can force humanity to prosper.
So Sanders with other tailors, they combine knowledge from across different fields. They used to have different things like physics and the biofields and the different social sciences, which of course don't make any sense anymore. Through this membrane, he can actually pull in his working space a knowledge from a field, combine it with something else. A 13-year-old can add something to that, and then it gets sent through Adna to a different story. This is part of what he does. So now it's about working together, collaboration, and it's about simulating a series of creation exercises is what it's really the new scientific method. So to finish, if these are the dimensions in 2079, what is the role for a company or a brand that back in the 2020s was trying to sell something? How did we move away from those types of companies and those types of brands to something that is much more, in a way, it's focused on the needs of these humans. It's sort of like a human-centered brand as opposed to a product or a service-centered brand or a market-centered brand. So as we go tonight to these next 100 years, I would invite you, pick one of these, make a note of it, one that you find interesting around integration of ideas or co-creation or the feedback loops, And then as you have these different thoughts through the night, push that and test that against this dimension. Maybe we're missing others. Maybe these are not the right ones. Maybe these are the wrong ones. In terms of the companies that make and create many of the things that today we desire, what would be different if we really needed them?